Imagine sitting at a dinner table, heart-pounding, because it's the first time you're meeting your boyfriend's parents. You've dressed your best, rehearsed polite small talk, even practiced how you'll laugh at his dad's corny jokes. You're ready to prove that you're worthy of being in their family. But before dessert even arrives, his father looks straight at you, smirks, and calls you street garbage. That one word, that one insult, it stuck to my skin like poison, and while everyone else sat frozen in silence, pretending it wasn't as bad as it sounded, I smiled. Because in that moment, something inside me flipped. They thought I would shrink. They thought I would stay quiet. But what they didn't know was that I had already learned how to survive people like him, and this time, I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to win. And by the time I was done, the man who called me garbage would lose something he valued more than his pride, and he'd never see it coming. I grew up in a neighborhood that most people avoided after dark. The kind of place where streetlights flickered, sidewalks cracked under the weight of years of neglect, and every corner store had bars on the windows. My mom raised me and my little brother by herself, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. We didn't have much, but what we did have, we cherished. Hand-me-down clothes, second-hand furniture, food stretched until payday. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. And despite the struggle, my mom instilled in me one unshakable belief. Where you come from doesn't define where you can go. I carried that with me everywhere. Through high school, when kids with better shoes and shinier cars laughed at my thrift store jackets. Through college, where I worked double shifts at a diner while trying to keep up with coursework. And even into adulthood, when I finally landed an office job that felt like the first step toward something better. That's where I met him. Daniel, my boyfriend. He was the opposite of everything I had known. Polished, confident, effortlessly charming. He came from a family where weekend brunches, golf memberships, and summer homes were normal. He had never worried about whether the rent check would clear or if the car would break down on the way to work. And yet, somehow, we clicked. Maybe it was because he wasn't arrogant the way some wealthy kids are. He noticed me in a way no one else had, asking questions, remembering small details, laughing at my jokes like they were the best he'd ever heard. At first, I kept my guard up. Guys like him didn't usually date girls like me. They dated girls who already came from money, who knew which fork to use at fancy dinners, who had family names that opened doors. I was the girl from the wrong side of town, the one with a patched-up car and a mom who worked herself to the bone. But Daniel didn't seem to care. In fact, he loved my grit, my work ethic, my independence. He would tell me, "You don't need anyone to hand you a ladder, you're building your own." Slowly, I let myself believe him. Our relationship grew serious. We spent weekends together, talked about future plans, even whispered about maybe moving in with each other someday. I had never felt more valued, more safe, more seen. But there was one looming shadow in all of this: his family. Daniel's mom and dad were old money, not new tech startup rich, but generational wealth rich. The kind of people whose names were on the walls of local art galleries and hospital wings. His dad, especially, had this aura of control around him. A man who never heard no in his life and who thought money could solve or silence everything. Daniel spoke about them sparingly. He loved his mom, tolerated his dad. From the little he shared, I gathered that his father was a man who measured people by their resumes, their family names, or the size of their bank accounts. To him, success wasn't about character, it was about currency. So when Daniel finally said, "I think it's time you met my parents," my stomach twisted into knots. On the one hand, I wanted them to like me. I wanted to prove that I wasn't some charity case or a fling he'd outgrow. On the other hand, I knew people like them. They didn't need to say much to make you feel small. A glance, a tone, a smirk, it was enough. Still, I agreed, because for Daniel, I would. The day of the dinner, I stood in front of my mirror for nearly an hour. I had one good dress, the one I saved for job interviews and weddings. Navy blue, modest but flattering. I paired it with simple earrings and shoes I had polished until they looked new again. I wanted to look like I belonged, even if every insecurity screamed that I didn't. Daniel picked me up, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "You look perfect. Don't worry about them, just be you." His confidence steadied me. The restaurant his parents chose was one of those upscale places with valet parking, white tablecloths, and waiters who pulled out your chair before you even reached it. I felt out of place the second I walked in, but I kept reminding myself, I deserve to be here. I belong with him. We spotted his parents at a corner table. His mom waved warmly, her pearls gleaming under the soft lights. She had the kind of effortless elegance that money could buy, but her smile, at least at first, seemed genuine. His dad, though, he barely looked up from his glass of wine as we approached. Introductions were made. I extended my hand politely. His mom shook it with both of hers, saying how lovely it was to finally meet me. His dad, he gave me a glance, a nod, and a grip that felt more like a test than a greeting. Dinner started out tolerable. Polite questions, small talk. His mom asked about my job, and I explained that I worked in marketing for a small firm. She seemed impressed, or at least she acted like it. His dad, however, leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, occasionally making comments that felt more like interrogations. "And your family, what do they do?" he asked. I explained about my mom, how hard she worked, how proud I was of her. His lips tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was clear he was assessing me, weighing me like a piece of property, and finding me lacking. But I held my composure. I smiled, answered with confidence, refused to shrink. And then, just when I thought maybe I could survive the night, he leaned forward, eyes narrowing, and said the words that would etch themselves into my memory forever. "So this is her. This is the girl you've been so serious about. Daniel, she looks like she came straight off the street. Garbage dressed up in a borrowed dress." The table froze. The words hit me like a slap. My cheeks burned, my stomach dropped, my hands trembled under the tablecloth. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the floor, to rewind time so I didn't have to sit there with his contempt dripping all over me. Daniel's face flushed with anger. "Dad," he started, but I cut him off with a calm I didn't even know I possessed. Because in that moment, I made a silent vow. I will not let this man break me. I smiled, lifted my glass of water, and took a sip as if nothing had happened. Outwardly, I stayed composed. Inwardly, I was already planning. Because if he thought I was street garbage, he was about to find out just how dangerous garbage can be when it catches fire. And that was the night everything began. The car ride home that night was eerily quiet. Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His jaw was clenched, his chest rising and falling faster than usual. I could tell he was boiling inside, trying to hold it together. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the blur of city lights. My reflection in the glass looked calm, too calm, almost detached, but inside my thoughts were racing. Street garbage. Those two words echoed over and over in my head, like they'd been burned into my skin. I thought of my mom, who had sacrificed everything for me and my brother. I thought of every late night I'd spent working 2 jobs while other kids partied. I thought of the degree I earned without help, the promotions I fought for, the independence I built with my own hands. And then I thought of him, this man who sat across a fancy dinner table, swirling his wine, and dismissed all of that with a single phrase. I clenched my fists in my lap. Garbage? No, I was fire. And fire burns down empires when it's underestimated. Daniel finally broke the silence. "I'm so sorry. I can't believe he said that. He's never." His voice cracked in frustration. "You didn't deserve that, not even close." I turned to him, forcing a smile. "It's okay." But it was. And he knew it. "It's not okay," Daniel snapped, pounding the steering wheel. "He humiliated you. He humiliated me. He crossed every line. I should have said more. I should have done something." I reached for his hand, resting mine gently over his. "You don't have to defend me, Daniel. I'm not weak. I can handle myself." That was true, but it was also incomplete, because handling myself wasn't enough. This wasn't about just shrugging it off. This was about making sure that man, his father, never forgot the mistake of underestimating me. When Daniel dropped me off at my apartment, he lingered at the door, guilt written all over his face. "Please don't let this ruin us. Please, I'll talk to him. I'll make him apologize." I shook my head. You can't make a man like that apologize, and if he did, it wouldn't mean anything. Don't waste your breath. He looked pained, like he didn't know how to fix what was broken. I leaned in, kissed him gently, and whispered, "We're fine, trust me." But the truth was, something had changed. Not between me and Daniel, but inside me. That night lit a fuse I didn't even know was waiting. The following days were a blur of polite texts from Daniel's mother. "It was lovely meeting you. I hope we can get together again soon." And absolute silence from his father. No apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. Daniel was furious. He avoided calls from home, barely spoke to his dad, and spent more time with me than ever. I could see he was torn between loyalty to me and loyalty to the man who had raised him. But I wasn't torn. The more I thought about that dinner, the more determined I became. His father thought he held all the cards: money, influence, power. But here's the thing about power. It's only real until someone pulls the rug out from under you. And I already knew his biggest weakness. See, Daniel had mentioned once in passing that his father had a delicate empire. Sure, he looked powerful, but a lot of it was smoke and mirrors. Loans stretched too thin, partnerships held together by fragile trust, a reputation that mattered more than reality. One bad move, one whisper in the right ear, one exposed secret, and it could all crumble. That night at dinner, when he called me street garbage, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't fight, I wouldn't play his game. But when the moment came, I'd flip his entire world upside down. And the best part, he would never see it coming. Because to him, I wasn't a threat. I wasn't even human enough to matter. I was just garbage. And that was the exact mistake that would cost him everything. But revenge doesn't happen overnight. I needed patience. I needed information. I needed to keep smiling, keep pretending, keep letting him believe he had the upper hand. So when Daniel invited me to his parents' house for a charity gala a month later, I said yes. Not because I wanted to see that man again, but because sometimes the best way to take down a king is to walk straight into his castle. And I was ready. The night of the gala felt like stepping into a different universe. Daniel held my hand tightly as we walked up the marble steps of his parents' estate, where glowing lanterns lined the pathway and luxury cars gleamed under the moonlight. The house looked less like a home and more like a palace, a monument to money, power, and ego. It should have been intimidating, but instead I felt a steady calm rising in me. This wasn't their arena anymore. It was mine. Inside, the place buzzed with chatter. Men in tailored suits sipped champagne. Women draped in designer gowns sparkled under the chandeliers. Waiters floated through the crowd carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres I couldn't pronounce. And right at the center of it all was Daniel's father, smiling, shaking hands, laughing that fake laugh people give when they're pretending to like someone. He looked powerful, unshakable. But now I knew better. Daniel kissed my cheek and whispered, "Ignore him tonight. Just enjoy yourself." I smiled, of course. But ignoring wasn't in the plan. The evening passed in a blur of polite introductions and rehearsed small talk. Daniel's mother stayed glued to my side, sweet but distracted, always scanning the crowd as if making sure every guest was comfortable. Meanwhile, I studied his father, every move, every glance, every handshake. I noticed how he lingered a little too long with certain businessmen. I noticed how his laugh was louder with some than others. I noticed how he avoided one man entirely, cutting conversations short, changing direction whenever he appeared. That man stood alone most of the evening, drink in hand, watching everything. His eyes were sharp, calculating. A rival, perhaps, or worse, a partner he'd wronged. The cracks were showing. At one point, Daniel excused himself to talk to a friend, and I slipped onto the balcony for some air. That's when I overheard it. Two older gentlemen stood just a few feet away, their voices low but urgent. "He can't keep juggling like this forever," one muttered. "If the board finds out." "SHH," the other interrupted. "Not here, but you're right. One wrong move and the whole thing comes down. It's a house of cards." My chest tightened. They were talking about him, Daniel's father. A house of cards. Exactly what Daniel had said once. And suddenly, I knew. My moment wasn't far off. Back inside, Daniel's father finally approached us. His smile was sharp, his tone dripping with condescension. "Well," he said, swirling his glass of wine, "you came back. I suppose you're tougher than you look. Maybe not entirely useless." Daniel stiffened. "Dad." I tilted my head, forcing a polite smile. "It's good to see you too." His smirk widened. He thought he was winning again, that his words still had the power to sting me. But inside, I felt only satisfaction. Because the truth was, I wasn't here to be liked. I was here to watch him unravel. As the night wound down, I caught one more detail. A young assistant, nervous, frantic, rushed to Daniel's father with a folder. He flipped through it quickly, his jaw tightening, before snapping the folder shut and handing it back. For the first time that evening, his mask slipped. It was only for a second, but I saw it. The panic, the desperation, the look of a man holding on too tightly to something already slipping through his fingers. And in that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold and hot with anticipation at the same time. He wasn't untouchable. He wasn't even stable. He was a king on a crumbling throne. And all it would take was the right push to bring him crashing down. That night, lying in bed beside Daniel, I replayed everything in my head. The overheard whispers, the nervous assistant, the folder, the way his father had avoided that lone man in the crowd. I didn't have the full picture yet, but I had enough to know one thing. His empire was fragile. And fragile things break beautifully when they finally fall. I whispered to myself before drifting off to sleep. Street garbage? No, I was the storm at his doorstep. And soon, he'd realize that too. The gala had ended, but the fire inside me had only just been lit. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about the whispers I'd overheard on the balcony. A house of cards. The phrase echoed in my head every night. It wasn't just an insult, it was a warning, and I needed to know what it meant. So while Daniel went about his work, I started my own. Quietly, patiently, like a shadow. It started small. I began noticing patterns. Documents Daniel's father left out when he visited, business cards that slipped from his pockets, conversations he had on speakerphone when he thought no one was listening. Most people would have ignored them. I collected them like puzzle pieces. And slowly, the picture formed. It wasn't just arrogance that fueled his empire. It was fraud. Fake numbers, shell companies, investors being strung along with promises that would never materialize. He wasn't the powerful mogul he pretended to be. He was a magician with cheap tricks and smoke. And eventually, every illusion shatters. The discovery should have scared me, but it didn't. Instead, I felt sharper, more alive than ever, because I realized something extraordinary. This man, who once called me street garbage to my face, had built his entire kingdom on garbage, and I was the one holding the match. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One night, Daniel and I were invited to another one of his father's networking dinners. Unlike the gala, this was smaller, tighter, just a handful of important men, gathered around a long table with expensive wine and an even more expensive facade of stability. I kept my head down, smiling politely, sipping my drink. But when Daniel excused himself to take a call, I wandered into his father's study. I shouldn't have. But I did. On his desk sat a laptop, still open, as if he'd left in a hurry. I shouldn't have looked. But the screen glowed with spreadsheets, numbers that didn't add up, emails about investor delays, reminders to move money from one account to another just to keep appearances afloat. And then, the jackpot, an unsent draft of an email. We cannot allow them to see the quarterly reports until the adjustments are complete. Delay if necessary. No one can know we're this far in the red. My pulse thundered. He was drowning and desperately trying to keep anyone from noticing. I snapped a photo on my phone before closing the laptop. My hands trembled, but not with fear, with power. Over the next weeks, I quietly collected more. Receipts, transfers, phone calls recorded when his voice slipped into panic. Every piece was another nail in the coffin he'd built for himself. Daniel never suspected. He thought I was just trying harder with his family. But no, I wasn't trying harder. I was preparing. Preparing for the moment his world would crack wide open. That moment came in the most unexpected way. I'd gone with Daniel to meet his father at a restaurant, another business dinner. As usual, his father strutted in like he owned the world, ordering the most expensive wine on the list, bragging about some new deal just about to close. But halfway through, the rival from the gala appeared. The man who had stood alone, drink in hand, watching everything. This time, he wasn't watching. He was coming straight for our table. The tension hit like a thunderclap. His father's smile faltered just for a second before snapping back into place. But the rival leaned close, his voice like steel. "Tick-tock," he said. "Your time," running out, "and when it does, I'll be there to watch it burn." He walked away, leaving silence behind. Daniel looked confused. His father laughed too loudly, brushing it off as old rivals. But I saw it again, that flicker of panic in his eyes. And I knew the end was near. That night, as Daniel slept, I pulled out everything I had collected, the photos, the emails, the recordings. Laid out in front of me, it looked less like evidence and more like destiny. His empire wasn't just fragile, it was already collapsing. All I had to do was give it the final push. And for once, I wasn't going to yell or fight or demand respect from him. No. I was going to do what he least expected. I was going to be silent, strategic, precise. The kind of silence that doesn't beg for mercy. The kind that watches as the walls fall down. He thought calling me street garbage would break me. But it only built the woman who was about to end him. The morning it all came crashing down, the sky was a heavy gray. Fitting, I thought. Storms have a way of cleansing the air, of making the world new again. I was sitting in my car, parked a block away from the office tower where Daniel's father held his empire together with lies and polished smiles. My hands were steady, my breathing calm, because this wasn't the moment I had waited for, it was the moment I had built. Inside my bag was a small flash drive. On it, every piece of evidence I'd collected. The fake numbers, the panicked emails, the recordings where he admitted in his own words how he'd manipulated investors. A full picture of a crumbling empire ready to be delivered. And I wasn't delivering it to him. I was delivering it to the people he had fooled. I slipped into the building unnoticed. Receptionists smiled, security waved me through. They knew me as Daniel's girlfriend, the polite one who always tagged along at dinners. They didn't know today was different. On the 10th floor, the conference room was already buzzing. Investors, sharp suits, watchful eyes. They had been promised a progress report, but instead, they were about to watch a man's mask shatter. I placed the envelope at the center of the table, nodded to the assistant who looked at me curiously, and walked out. Minutes later, the shouting began. I didn't need to stay. I didn't need to watch. I already knew how it would unfold. The documents would be opened, the recordings played, the truth spilling into the air like poison gas. Investors storming out. Phones ringing with lawyers on the other end. And Daniel's father, red-faced and desperate, scrambling to explain lies that could no longer be explained. His empire hadn't just fallen, it had been exposed. Daniel found out hours later. He came to my apartment, eyes wide, his voice broken. They pulled everything. The investors, the contracts, the banks, my dad's he's finished. I looked at him carefully. He wasn't like his father. He wasn't arrogant, cruel, or blind to the truth. He was just caught in the storm of a man who thought he was untouchable. And so I told him the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Your father built everything on lies, and lies don't last forever. He stared at me for a long time, like he was piecing things together. Like maybe he suspected I knew more than I was admitting. But he didn't ask. Not then. A week later, the newspapers told the rest of the story. Local business tycoon under investigation for fraud. Headlines spread like wildfire, every detail laid bare. The once proud man who looked down at me across a dinner table, calling me street garbage, was now photographed ducking reporters, his fortune unraveling, his name dragged through the mud. I cut the articles out and tucked them into a drawer, not as trophies, as reminders. Because this wasn't just revenge, this was justice. The next time I saw him, months later, the arrogance was gone. The expensive suit replaced with something wrinkled and tired. His face looked smaller, older, as if the weight of his crumbling empire had shrunk him. For a moment I almost pitied him, almost. But then I remembered that night. His voice, sharp and cruel, calling me garbage in front of the man I loved. His smirk when he thought I was beneath him. And I realized, no, I didn't pity him, not one bit. Daniel and I eventually moved on. Our relationship wasn't untouched. We had cracks, trust issues, scars left behind by the chaos of his father. But we worked through them. We built something of our own, away from his family's shadow, something real. And as for his father, he never recovered. His empire was gone, his reputation ruined, his power stripped. He lived in the silence of his own downfall, a silence I had crafted for him. People sometimes ask if I ever regretted it, if maybe I went too far. But here, the truth, I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself. I just made sure the world finally saw who he really was. And if that makes me garbage in his eyes, then let him choke on it. Because the so-called garbage outlasted his empire. And in the end, I was the one left standing.